welcome back to Getting Your Ducks in a Row. Today we're joined by Kane St Quintin, founder of Visibly, and someone who's on a mission to make the hardest parts of construction a whole lot smarter. Kane's journey started growing up in a family highways business, working boots on the ground before moving into tech to tackle the kind of inefficiencies and compliance challenges that frustrate teams across the supply chain. In this episode, we talk about building a platform that actually works for site workers and senior leaders, using AI to automate the boring stuff, and how digital tools can help fix knowledge gaps, safety risks, and broken systems across the built environment. If you're interested in the future of construction and how real change actually happens, you'll love this one. Enjoy. Morning, Kane. Welcome to the show.
Morning. How's it going?
Yes, all very good, thank you. Good to have you on today, and I'm very interested in your journey to founding Visibly. So you've gone from working boots on the ground in highways and infrastructure to founding a tech company that's changing how compliance works. What was the moment or insight that led you to making that transition and change?
Yeah, I think for me it started at the beginning. So I grew up in a family business. The goal was always to work there and be part of a company. And so yeah, like early on the weekends and things, a lot of the kids were at the park or whatever, and I was on the back of a truck helping out with whatever I could do. Yeah, and it really started from there. And as I grew in the company and went through uni, it was always a mixture between learning and working. And it was always just thinking how could things be bigger? How could things be better? And to some degree, like how could things be easier? You know, anyone that works in contracting type roles will know that it's a tough gig. And I think that journey of really trying to understand what's the most important thing and how can we change things for the better, I guess started this journey and ultimately ended up in me leaving the family business. So I think for me the key thing was really identifying, people are the most important part of a company. I think everybody says that people are the most important part of a company, but when you actually have a tech product, for example, actually most of your customers will interface with your product and they'll only interface with your people when they're selling or when they speak to customer service. When you're in construction, the built environment, architecture, whatever, the people are the product, the people are the service. And this real struggle for me was, how do we really invest in people? Like, how do we make our people the best people? How do we make them the happiest? How do we help fulfill them when we're competing with everything else? Productivity targets, thin margins, eroding profits, etc. And I think that realization that something fundamentally had to change to enable us to do that as a company, or really to enable any company to do that. I think that was the realization for me, that just doing the same thing, the kind of incremental gains of improving a kind of boots on the ground, contracting company probably wasn't going to cut it. And actually something fundamental needed to change. Founding a tech company and actually bringing more capital, like more investment, more quality in terms of the technology, maybe the capabilities of the wider team. I think that was the starting point for me.
It's interesting you talk about the how businesses or companies value their people. It's an interesting point, and it's something that we implement here. And it's not always easy, and as you say, a lot of people say it, but do they truly act or operate in a way that is true to that? Often, not often, but in some cases, no. But how did you find, we work in similar industries doing different things, but dealing with the same type of people. How have you found the uptake for that sort of outlook? The reason I ask is, you'll know better than most, having started off in the industry very early doors, but construction built environment is quite traditional, and has been that way for a long time, and sort of new ideas and new ways of doing things can, the industry can be fairly slow on the uptake at sometimes. I'm just interested to see what it's been like for you.
Yeah, I think the 2 points kind of come hand in hand, because I think there's a view of a view of sometimes a lack of willingness to invest in people and almost like lip service. And I think that definitely exists. I think actually the bigger problem is a lack of ability. Like, if you literally don't have the money in the company, if you don't have the time in the company, if you don't have the capabilities, and actually you're using like 110% of everything you've got just to operate and just to pay the bills and keep everyone gainfully employed, that you can't do anymore. And so I think that was the original starting point for me to transition into a tech company to support the industry as a whole, and make that change and make that impact. But I think that ties into your question in terms of the uptake, because it does require like a fundamental mindset shift. I think so many people, maybe full stop, certainly like outside of like tech heavy industries, the default is let's keep doing what we're doing and doing it a little bit better, because there are inherent risks. I think one of the things when we talk about compliance or safety or quality and this kind of thing, if you ship a bad bit of code, worst case scenario, you would assume you're probably going to have an outage. More likely scenario, the experience will just be a bit rubbish and you'll fix it. No problem. But actually, there are like hundreds and thousands of automated tests to stop that actually happening. When you get into the real world in construction and built environments, if you start excavating in the wrong place and that hits a high pressure gas main, like the difference is pretty substantial, there are some severe consequences to that. So I think there's definitely a mindset shift needed in terms of what's possible. And I think much more is possible now than it has been. But I think also, understandably, there is some concern from a business kind of continuity risk perspective, but also just a general like people risk perspective, to do things differently. So that's definitely a challenge that we face. I think a lot of people in the construction or built environment sectors face those challenges as well. Um, but the reality is things have to change. Like that's unavoidable. And I think even if you just go back to the base of like health and safety legislation about, doing what's reasonably practicable to avoid harm, or whichever way you look at it, what was reasonable 10, 20, 30 years ago is not really reasonable anymore. Like the bar is substantially higher because things are more accessible. And so I think, I think as an industry, it takes time. Um, I think that's okay. And I think the winners move quicker and people just tag on at the end, and that's life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you said there, there's always a leading period, right? When innovation or new ways of doing things, whatever you want to call it, come into an industry sector. Depending on the nature of the people that are the decision makers within that industry, I think dictates how quickly the uptake is. And I think perhaps there's an argument to say that in construction, the generation of decision makers have been fairly traditional, but that is changing, and the conversations we're having with clients and the uptake is increasing in terms of speed. That we're getting a new generation now of people coming through who are sitting at the top of the tree and making these decisions, and they want and expect a different way of doing things. And I think, to your point, things will take time. It has to happen. But I think as time passes and gradually as that new generation comes through, that will sort of speeding up the process. In terms of Visibly's approach, how does it change the way that managers, operators, your clients handle sort of compliance day to day, and what makes it more effective?
Yeah, I think the way we think about this is, and I think compliance is kind of the core part of it as a foundation, because it's actually not where we started. We actually started going substantially above compliance. But tied to the previous point, I think actually the realization was there were many companies that were struggling to actually maintain the right level of compliance they wanted. So that was a sensible starting point. And it comes back again to this ability, and really it's often just distribution of resources and priorities. And what we saw speaking to owner managers, health and safety or compliance directors, etc., is that the balance they were trying to deal with was the impact they really wanted to have and everything else that goes with that. All of the admin, all of the shifting data around, all of the reporting, all of the needs, the necessary things, but it wasn't really the impact. And what we saw fundamentally is like give or take 80% of the resources, whether that's time, money, brain power, was basically spent on fairly administrative tasks, and you only ever end up with 20% of the time spent on real world impact. And so for us, that was then the starting point, which is okay, if people go into these professions to all professions, I guess, to have an impact, right? They want to build a structure that's going to support a community for decades, or if they're in a safety team, they want to make people safer and they want people to return home and all of this kind of thing. If we could flip that and we could say, oh, okay, well maybe it's only 20% of admin or less, and actually 80% of what you're doing is impact. If you could 4x the impact that every individual had, that would make a fundamental change, to that individual, their organization, but then actually like the community as a whole. So for us, that's really the goal, is actually almost just like churning through all these layers of inefficiency and admin and manual work that people have to do to actually have an impact. So anywhere that you're updating a spreadsheet manually, or you're having to like collate data together, or for bigger customers, they go past spreadsheets, they then have systems. They have one system, and they have unified systems. They have many, 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 many systems. And
Yeah.
actually, often it becomes actually more difficult. Well, what actually happens is a spreadsheet always makes a comeback, right? So, one of our biggest customers, they're a multinational. They have X like 100,000 people, working in frontline roles. They have something crazy like 15 different systems, managing people compliance related data. Um, and the only way they can manage that is they export everything on a monthly or quarterly basis, and they just bring it all into a spreadsheet, which is crazy because they might as well have stayed with the spreadsheet in the first place. So yeah, it's basically trying to take all of those elements, and just simplify that admin burden. And that's a very like office-based example. And I think a more site-based example, which is for me like one of my favorite things that we do, is when people think about supervision, which is a legal requirement in terms of safety, it's always about a supervisor, a manager, stopping whatever they're usually doing, going out to site, doing some kind of spot check, filling out a check sheet, and then move on, right? Maybe they'll do some trends, maybe they won't, and everyone's happy, supervision done. But it's just illogical. Like, how often are you getting that feedback loop as a member of the team? Like, how often are you getting oh, you did great on this, or oh, actually, maybe you could do this a bit better? The reality is it ends up being like months apart. Um, and it goes back to what was reasonable. Maybe 30 years ago, that was reasonable because there were no other alternatives. You can't afford to send, an expert Sparky to follow every other Sparky to make sure that they're getting a good feedback loop. Like, you just send the good one in the first place, right? That doesn't make
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense. That's why apprenticeships and stuff exist. So that doesn't make sense. But actually now you can. So, using our platform, people get challenges. Show me how you stick with the Sparky thing, kind of why this plug, or whatever, right? How do you do X in your role? People can take videos, kind of talk through how they're doing it. Maybe they get a colleague to show them or whatever. And then we basically route that to the best people in the team who are the most capable in those areas. And it creates these like rapid feedback loops. So if someone actually needs help, they can get it from experts throughout the entire organization. They can be in a completely different part of the country, as an example. But it also builds up this profile, and the objective isn't, you don't pass or fail. There's no audit to pass here. It becomes like an ongoing like learning process. Because sometimes for people that are the best, they do X part of the role, but they don't do Y. So when they then come to Y, they're then like, oh, I haven't done this for 3 years. I'm highly qualified. I'm the expert, but actually, I'm not quite sure how to do it. So it's really just about eliminating the trade-offs. Like, that's the way we think about it. Like, eliminating all of these barriers that just made it hard to actually support and invest in your people, which ultimately is the requirement of compliance, is the requirement of a business being effective.
That's a really interesting point. And we work with a civil engineering firm. and they've grown fairly quickly over the past sort of 5 or so years. And one of the things that they are, I say struggling with, is probably putting it, it's too grave a term, but one of the troubles, or some of the trouble they're having, and this isn't just them as a business, this is, I think, as a result of the industry as a whole, when we look at skill shortages and the sort of lack of younger people coming through into the industry, is they have, a board of directors, all of which, there are 7, 8 of them. Each of them has, they're there because they have a certain element of expertise or a certain role that they serve. And that works very well for the business, and they've done very well as a business. But there's a real, there seems to be a gap between the board, as it were, and the people beneath the board that are in the sort of divisional positions, divisional directors, and then beneath that, the sort of area managers and things like that, feeding all the way down to the more junior staff. And the problem they're having is the directors are fountains of knowledge. When you and there's obviously they need to train their staff, build them up, make sure that knowledge is being passed down. But when you throw in a lack of younger people coming in to the industry, combined now with more of a focus on home working, it makes it even harder for that knowledge and those processes and all the rest of it to filter down and bring these new people up. And it's something that that sort of mid-level management, if you could call it that, they're really struggling to find good people to fill those roles. They've got great apprentices coming through, and they have a very strong managerial structure, but that middle gap, they're really struggling. And something like what you're mentioning there, having these processes in place, having this feedback loop, and enabling knowledge sharing and all the rest of it, I think could really help with that sort of situation for businesses that are struggling with that.
Yeah, I think the situation you're describing is one we see constantly. And I think it was interesting. The original or the beginning of the point you made was that they've grown quickly. Like that becomes the tricky bit. If you're only ever adding on like a couple of people a year and you're going step by step, or you're already just like really big, like the reality is it's probably not great, but you've worked out a way to do whatever it is that you need to do on a consistent basis. But actually, what ends up happening is this problem that you're describing, and actually some of the kind of safety, quality, compliance type things actually ends up becoming a bottleneck to growth for the exact reason that you just described is, you know, we're not in a scenario just yet where you can actually like replicate people. You know, if you could replicate your industry veterans who have forgotten way more than anyone else has ever learned and all of this kind of stuff. If you could do that, like of course, right? Like then you're in a great spot, and especially if they're robots and they don't sleep or whatever, then they don't take days off, and
We might get there soon, sooner than we think
yeah,
potentially.
but yeah, potentially maybe one day for definite. And I think there's definitely directions of travel there in terms of training like AI models and building agents to support some of this. But as is always the case, the majority of all of the big like tech evolutions are always focused on consumer or kind of office-based work, right? That's the market. The difficult piece, a really good example actually is like your ISO accreditations. Basically every tech company, especially like startups with investors, will get their kind of ISO certifications like super early. It's really easy. And one of the reasons for that is because everything is fundamentally digital, the providers that support with that just have loads of feeds. They just connect everything together, and it tells you, okay, well, this is what you're like, where you're not compliant, this is where you are compliant, etc., etc. Then you fix it, and it just maintains itself. Awesome. That's really easy if everything is digital. But when the fundamentals of what you do is a real world thing, you're not talking about, oh, we've got 20 database tables and this and that and the other. You're saying, oh, we've got like 25,000 people dotted all over the country, multiple countries, working on different contracts, different sectors, different regulations, often competing regulation. Yeah. When you get all of those things and the reality of whether you actually are, and compliance is almost the fundamental like foundation. We're not really talking about compliance. What we're just talking about is like doing a good job. Like that's ultimately what we're talking about. When it
Consistently
comes,
as well.
yeah, exactly. And when it comes down to that, and the reality is like that becomes like a much more difficult challenge, and that's why it's been avoided. You know, people don't come out of Harvard or Stanford or Oxford or wherever, and they're like, haha, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna tackle this like problem in the construction sector, or even like deskless workers. The deskless workforce is estimated to be like 80+% of the entire like global workforce is deskless. I.e. they're standing on their feet, they're in a factory or construction or retail or whatever. But like people don't just rock out of uni randomly and think, oh, I'm going to do that. They're like, oh no, I'm going to make like a new social media platform, or I'm going to make like a new music streaming thing, or whatever. One, because they don't really know, like why would they know that, right? They just wouldn't. So they don't even know about the problems. They certainly haven't experienced the problems. And I sometimes get founders that are still working out what they want to found coming to me and sometimes say, oh well, you've like started a couple of companies in the space. Actually we didn't think about construction, but it's really interesting because it's big, right? Everyone loves a big market in tech. Like that's great, you need a big market. And then you talk through it and people are just like, oh wow, right, yep, I get why no one else is touching this, like we're going to leave it alone. And I think those challenges you're talking about are like they're the fundamental like systemic challenges for the entire industry. Is how do we fix those? And I think for us and for me personally, it's not about fixing it for me or fixing it like for my company or whatever. If I can fix or improve things, and that's obviously what we're trying to do as a company, and we can enable others to do that for their own businesses and for their own people, that's worthwhile. Like that's meaningful. And the reality is, you strip away construction, you've got nothing.
Yeah.
We're both in buildings. We're on Zoom, Riverside, like needs the internet, needs the power, needs everything. It came in on the train. All this stuff needs to be built. All needs to be maintained. We all get very upset when it doesn't work,
Yeah.
but no one thinks about it when, no one thinks about it when, um, when it's being built. Like, how did it get built? How did it get maintained? And in one of our sort of investment committee pitches to Creandum. So they're our sort of lead investor, invested in a bunch of epic companies, Spotify, Klarna, Lovable, etc. Um, Great companies. And my final kind of statement is like, why invest in this versus something else, right? Like, and it wasn't because of us as a team or us as a company. It's because it actually matters. At that point we had, partners and people, there may be 30 or so people on the call from multiple different offices across the entire world, probably very nice offices as well. None of what we were doing would have been possible without the actual people on the ground and the companies that are doing the graft. And it often isn't your Balfour Beatty or your Kia or whomever. It's not just them. It's the entire supply chain that supports them. And that comes all the way back like full circle. So like that was my dad. Like that, that was me. That was us and the families that we were working with. Um, that that were actually delivering on those projects, or not, and that's the challenge really. It's a tough one, super tough.
Yeah, there's a couple of points there that you mentioned and sort of really resonated. So one of them you mentioned about construction, and it's a cornerstone of the economy. As you say, if the infrastructure doesn't work properly, things fall down very quickly. And earlier on, one of the sort of earlier points you made there about transitioning the real world, what is a physical thing, into digital, and allowing the compliance systems that you're able to put in place that are based around digital to work properly, I think is an interesting point, because everything that in construction is tangible, you can touch, feel it, see it. It's not like we're selling, I don't know, pens on Amazon here, although you can touch and feel a pen. But my point being, we're dealing with real solid things here. And the people that are dealing with them are boots on the ground there in the environment doing it. And so historically, things have always been done pen and paper, or in a very sort of undigital way, if that's even a term. So there's almost there's the steps that you're talking about, which is helping, with compliance and the digital systems they've got. And this may be something that you help with as well. But I think there's also a step before that, which is putting the systems in place to allow the people on the ground to feed into a digital system that forms part of the bigger ecosystem. And we see a lot of that in what we do. And you mentioned earlier about the systems that these companies have. They've purchased a CRM 6 months ago, they're not using it properly, or they don't quite understand the capabilities that it has. So then they end up going with something else to serve another purpose. And before they know it, especially if they're a big business, they've got 4 or 5 different systems doing 4 or 5 different things, when actually one would be fine if you knew how to use it properly. We see it all the time. And I think with what you're doing as well, and you mentioned the ISOs, we've got a client at the moment that is being audited for I think it's ISO 9001. I think that's what it's called.
Yep. Yep.
And the audit and the exercises that they're having to go through from a project management perspective to make sure everything is compliant and is as it should be, and the systems are being used properly. And if they're not, there are internal audits going on. There's so much work that goes into it, but the fundamental thing here is, because of the nature of the work they're doing, because of the type of work they're doing, and on the scale that they're doing it, it's a necessary evil to make sure it's done properly and safely.
Yeah, I think there's a maybe like three points out of that. Like the first piece is the interface with the actual human, the person on the ground. Like you're 100% right. I can tell you it's easy. You could literally line up 100 screenshots of systems on a wall or on a screen or something, and you could have one of them as a construction or like a frontline worker tool, and I'll tell you which one it is within seconds, because it's always the worst. Like, it always looks like a piece of crap, and because often, always is a bit strong, but like the vast majority of the time, um, to be fair, even our first version of the product, right, it also looked rubbish, right, because you're sort of stacking up against where everybody else is. But although actually ours didn't look very good, our approach was the reverse of the norm. The norm is, this is like the system we're selling to the management team, we're selling to the people in the office. So we'll invest there, and then we'll have like an add-on. People used to call it like a companion app, back in the day. And it's just literally the wrong way around. Like, it needs to be the frontline person first. So, one of our elements of our product, one of the bits of feedback we usually get from the management team when we demo it or whatever, is they're like, "Oh, this is like a bit simple," as a negative. And we're like, "Yeah, it is. Like, that's why your
Isn't it
workers
great?
will actually use it. Like, that's
Yeah.
why your workers will actually use it." And what ends up happening is, actually, when the workers are then like hands-on, the frontline people are hands-on, they actually don't hate it, right? Trying to get a construction worker to like love a product is pretty tough, because often they're doing things that don't benefit them. It's just extra work they have. It doesn't help them, and I think that becomes the product's kind of interface side of it is one thing, but also the motivation is the other. Is when your job is to graft and lay loads of bricks, or excavate in the highway, or put out like 5 different sets of temporary traffic lights a day or whatever, and then some grad with a jazzy idea has come up with this like thing that, oh, you're now going to have to fill out 42 forms a day on top of it. Oh, but you still have to do the 5 jobs that you were required. There becomes like a motivational like benefit thing there, which is like, well, like, why? Like, how does that actually help me? And what it usually is data collection to reduce having to employ like administrators in the actual office. But for us, like, a very, very key piece of this, and we've been deliberate, and it sometimes causes us challenges with potential customers, is we are very clear that the workforce kind of frontline app piece has to be primarily focused on the worker. So any interaction, there has to be a clear, tangible benefit for them to do it. So, for example, the kind of challenges that we were talking about, they're called challenges. because you build up scores and you give feedback to different people. And the more feedback you give and the more helpful the feedback is, the higher your score is. And the more challenges you complete, whether they're good or bad or indifferent, the more points you get, etc. And like points do make prizes in this instance, so there are leaderboards, there are rewards. We do some across the entire platform. Companies also do their own. And what actually happens is people just build up a profile, and people and companies are starting to use their, kind of staff's Visibly profile to help understand, okay, well, who do we prioritize for training? Either because there's a gap, or actually we can see that they're ready to take the next step up. So when they're thinking about promotions, instead of initially just going, oh, we'll go out to the markets, but we know it's going to be really tough to find, they can actually see, okay, well, Jason has been absolutely nailing this. Maybe it's time we invest more into him. And I think that the different mindset of trying to optimize to make it as easy as possible for the frontline worker to do what they need to do, tap the buttons or whatever. We have a duty of care kind of safety management sort of lone worker feature throughout an entire worker's day. I think they have to interact with the app on average for about 45 seconds. So for about 45 seconds, it covers all of the key like safety requirements needed for them to make sure that they are protected for the entire day. The other alternative tools, they're like, oh, this is great. Your workforce have been on our app for like 2 hours today. Well, like, they're supposed to be doing something. Like, what are they not doing whilst they're on there for 2 hours? And it doesn't stack up for the company in the end. It doesn't stack up for the individual. So making things as clean and fresh and as simple and as easy and as useful for the person that's actually using it means they'll actually use it. And then actually layering in that motivation, that's the kind of thing that helps build that culture. And it's super tricky to do that historically, but actually now it's definitely possible.
I think the point you raised there at the start about it being a simple system for people to use and it being almost seen as a negative, which actually it's the other way around, it's positive, is such a benefit, because any system that you have, whether it's whatever it is, any digital system that you are feeding information into to paint a broader picture, shall we say, to sort of boil it down, is only as good, that picture that it's painting can only be as good as the information that is being put into it. If you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. And the start of this process, in the example that you gave there, are the boots on the ground using this system to feed information into it. Now, if they don't have an inclination to use it, it's not because it's not intuitive, or it just takes up too much time, or it's just frustrating to use, then there isn't that desire to use it, which then means that what the output that you get isn't as efficient, as effective as you'd want it to be, or the reason you're using it for. So I think that is, to my sort of points earlier that I raised, it's that step before the almost implementation of the overall that you're getting. It's making sure that the data that you're able to put into it and the people that are using it are able to, one, use it effectively and put the right data in.
Yeah.
So I think that's really
Yeah.
good. What are you seeing in terms of sectors within the industry? So main contractors, architects, civil engineers, the full raft of specialisms in the industry that we work in. Where are you seeing the uptake most, and where are you seeing the need most?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's a great question, because in terms of the uptake, it's not consistent in terms of principal contractor or kind of subcontractor or sector specific. I think and that's probably just like I think that's probably a timing thing. The need is really interesting, because the obvious answer is the organization that has the closest kind of relationship to the workforce. You would suggest that's where the need is, because
That's what I thought you was going to say. Yeah.
and that's the obvious answer, and I think that's largely true. I think that's largely true because they have the closest level of responsibility. I think what's really interesting for me is the general mindset in terms of like contracting and subcontracting. And if you kind of try and tie this back to health and safety legislation and HSE guidance and this kind of thing. And I think principal contractors, and even to some degree clients, actually to a lot of degree clients, um, have very much relied on the idea that their responsibility is to have arrangements in place to make sure that the supply chain is doing what they should. So, for example, say supervision, the viewpoint as a principal contractor is very rarely, okay, we need to actively supervise throughout the supply chain. They're contracting out, right? So they're like, well, why would we do that? Their viewpoint is we will have our arrangements will dictate that we'll check the policies, we'll check the arrangements of our contractors, and we'll spot check, whether they're actually doing it and whether they're fulfilling it. So there becomes this kind of this kind of like watering down of responsibility, because it's almost there's just a policy and a procedure on top of a policy and procedure on top of a policy and procedure. And what ends up happening is ultimately the people at the top of the chain and what's actually happening at the bottom of the chain are so disconnected, you're neither here nor there. Now, when you go back through the paper trail, you'll be like, oh, well, this policy said this and this company didn't do that, so therefore they're responsible. Or, so the responsibility is from almost like a paperwork perspective is obviously important, but actually the responsibility of a real world perspective, I think that's somewhere that's really lagging. And I think what's going to be really interesting is as more and more organizations adopt, not just visibly, but the kind of approach where actually there is visibility available from the top to the bottom. We have a couple of like main clients, their supply chain is really deep, like really deep. Like sometimes there's like 6 or 7 levels of subcontracting before you actually get to the specialist that's doing that particular role. But they actually have visibility from the top all the way down to the bottom in terms of, the basics that you would expect. Who are the actual people? Like, do they have the right qualifications in place? Is the quality there? Like, is the right supervision in place, et cetera, et cetera. And the crazy thing is, it's no harder. They don't actually have to put any more effort or resources or anything in place to have that visibility top to bottom of the supply chain anymore. Because the process is a fundamentally digital one, it doesn't matter whether the person on the front line is a direct employee or is working multiple levels down the supply chain. The fundamental principle that, if you think about it as a network, the network is the same, right? They're just networked people. It doesn't make any difference. And I think for me, I think it will be interesting over the next 5, 10 years to see how this evolves, because I would imagine there will be investigations where usually like bad things have happened, and the question will be asked, well, like why? Why
Right.
did you just rely on an arrangement or a policy or an annual check or a quarterly check or whatever? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there's reasonable justification for that it's like not economically viable to even do this stuff. And you have to rely on this kind of like delegated responsibility. But today, it doesn't need to be that way. So we talk about this idea of like shared responsibility. And everybody says, oh, everybody's responsible for safety, everybody's responsible for quality and everything else. But actually, in the real world, the vast majority of that responsibility is just delegated off to somebody else. And so, whether that's wrong or not is currently like a choice, maybe like a preference. But I think, and to be honest, I hope in time it becomes like the norm, because that's the only real way in my mind to make people safer, like to actually deliver better quality more consistently, to be more productive. I think that's the only way to do it, is actually just to bring this stuff out of the black box, bring it up to, bring it into the light almost, and actually say, well, okay, we know things are going to go wrong, but we're proactively identifying them. We're thinking about leading rather than lagging behind. We're not waiting for an injury. We're actually, this is the point of like near miss reports and this kind of thing. The idea is you're supposed to be, gaining these insights and this data up front. If the only way of knowing this stuff up front is you rely on your frontline people reporting stuff all the time, like you're not going to stand a chance. But if you just get used to a data flow, if you get used to it being a conversation, if you just get used to understanding and working together in the same way as you would in an office, right? You see someone doing something dumb in the office every day, you just have a chat with them. But it's really difficult to do that when your workforce is spread all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the or one of certainly the biggest challenges that face particularly contractors when you have that full supply chain as well. And also, I mean, I don't think there are sort of blurred lines as such, but when you look at main contractors that are subcontracting out, and then where does the buck stop? And you have a workforce that is spanning, hundreds of people or thousands of people in some cases, and the people, as you say, that disconnect between the people that are ultimately responsible for enforcing this level of safety, for example, how is that getting down? And making sure that it's not watered down, the point you use, which I think is a great point, it's not watered down as it follows that sort of supply chain down, I think is a key point.
Yeah,
Um,
and I don't think it's a, and back to even the earlier point, like at the very start, is I don't think it's actually a lack of caring. I don't think it's a lack of willingness. Um, I think it's the fact that it's been exceedingly difficult to do it previously, and so that's just the way things have happened. And the challenge is especially if you're in a risk-driven business, your objective is reducing risk. So actually saying, okay, we're going to try something different, we're going to do something different because it could be way better. That in itself introduces risk. So, for me, I think we always talk about construction and equivalent sectors, the slow uptake and being traditional. And actually, and that's true, like we can't avoid that. But I actually think we could go further in actually really celebrating the people that are taking the risk to try and improve. Yeah.
and have much more to risk and lose here. You know, people that are on the front line doing these roles, it's not, you know, they aren't sitting behind a computer writing code. These are people that are in risky jobs, understand that, and actually, keep the country running in a lot of cases. We talk about the infrastructure and, construction buildings, etc., etc. I mean, it's multifaceted and it's huge. But your point, celebrating that and understanding it, and I think when you start at that point, you then make it a lot easier to build systems and whatever else off of the back of that enforce that safety and ultimately keep people safe and make sure things are being done the right way.
Yeah, exactly, and it kind of makes me laugh because my LinkedIn is kind of destroyed because it has some weird mix of tech and founder and kind of VC, like 50% over here and then kind of 50% construction, built environment, etc., etc. So it does get itself in a muddle, but it's funny because in the kind of startup world, there's a bit of a kind of cultural debate going on about basically how hard you should work. And I think the kind of AI gold rush is in full flow. So there's a lot of talk about 996, which is basically working 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And yeah, you get different camps as always, and there's one camp which is very much that. It's just like grinding and this is a time to put everything into trying to build a huge successful businesses. And then you get the other group who are like, oh no, work-life balance, etc., etc. But 996 is actually hilarious because it's not a long shift for someone in construction, right? Like a 12-hour shift is, you know, 12 hour shift is easy, right? Like, you put that in front of certain people, obviously within like, regulations. I know driving and stuff is different, but you put that in front of like an ops manager or frontline workers, and it's like a 12-hour day, and they're like, am I getting a break today? Like, is it easy? And the work is fundamentally different. You're in you're in an air-conned office and you're typing away, and your fingers might get a bit tired or whatever. Or you're doing like loads of growth experiments and all of the stuff that personally, like, I like a lot, and our team do it, so it's not diminishing any of that work at all. But to me, it's just is an interesting disconnect between the reality, and it's for me, like, I'm a bit older these days. I definitely am not doing things out on site. If I pull a long shift on my computer, like, I'm definitely tired the next day. Like, that's one thing. Doing the same thing day in, day out when it's super hot on the side of a motorway, you're never sure whether someone's going to swear at you or throw a McDonald's like milkshake at you, et cetera, et cetera. Fundamentally, like different worlds, right?
Different
And
worlds, yeah.
yeah, very, very different worlds. And I think as humans, we're kind of very well programmed to think in our own sort of headspace and our own ecosystem. But the vast majority of people don't have that realization about what actually goes on day to day. Yeah, so I think anything that we or anybody else can do to support that is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Kane, tell us about your fundraising efforts. 'Cause in my research before this podcast, I did a bit of delving into Visibly, and there's a sort of news articles, I think, from last year about some funds that you raised for the business, and it's not an insignificant amount of sum of money. How did that all come about, and how has that sort of helped you implement what you're doing into businesses in the sector?
Yeah, so in terms of the fundraising, like as I mentioned earlier, when I kind of took the decision or maybe came to the realization that there needed to be like a bigger change, there needed to be a bigger impact, that requires resources that you can't just start like bit by bit by bit. So yeah, the path was raising funding from VCs or like venture capitalists, if you like. So trying to think about the best sort of context here. In between Visibly and my family business, I founded another business. So it was a labor marketplace. So the goal there was basically to help the best kind of almost like freelance, like contractor type, sort of like small, like independent contractor, tradespeople basically find the best opportunities. And actually, instead of having to go all the way through the supply chain, they could kind of team up and deliver their services directly to like principal contractors or even clients. So that was the base goal. So I managed to raise some investment for that. I grew the business to a particular level. It wasn't going any further and didn't kind of grow to the level that we needed. And so yeah, that was the first kind of venture, I guess, into the kind of fusion between the digital world and the VC driven world and construction and the real world. So yeah, learned a lot of lessons from that. But the main kind of blocker for us growing that business was this kind of compliance and quality element, which is, you can be the best individual in the world or you can be the best kind of small business in the world, but actually when it comes to trying to supply at the top of the chain, there is no blurred lines, like there are no like places to hide if you don't have all of the right things in place. Like you can't access those contracts or that work, and that was ultimately what stopped our growth. Like we had like getting on for like 100,000 really capable people on our platform, but we could only use about 200 of them because everybody else just had these huge like compliance gaps and there was just no way to fill them. It didn't mean they weren't capable, it didn't mean they weren't good, and they weren't necessarily working in a non-compliant way previously, but it just didn't kind of stack up. So there was a kind of interim, it wasn't interim at the time, but ended up being interim business there. And I think off the back of that, yeah, once you raise, you kind of get how the whole world works. So yeah, when it came to Visibly, I already had a bunch of connections in terms of the best investors who I thought would be able to support our mission and actually understand like what we were doing rather than just sort of giving us a check, and some great people to join the team. So yeah, really it was just bringing the team together, and kicking that off. So yeah, I mentioned Creandum previously. Camp are one of our other investors. They've invested in people like Wise and Revolut, and also Bright Eye, who are sort of educational focused VC. So yeah, that was the kind of team that we brought together. I think we raised maybe like $7.5 million. It was in pounds, but the dollar value sounds bigger and it's rounder. But yeah, so we raised that, and that's basically enabled us to like try things, experiment, like do things that we think and we hope, speaking to the market, are going to make a real difference. But it enables us to have some of the best software engineers that we can get, like bring together industry experts and that kind of technical expertise, and actually make the kind of investments in building out the product and building out the service around that to support customers. So yeah, that's generally been the funding journey.
So the funding, Kane, that you've raised and that's allowed you to essentially invest in your business and sort of push the boundaries, I suppose, as it were, and try things that or experiment with things that you perhaps wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. How do you see that following through? How do you see that sort of changing or evolving the compliance landscape in our industry, and also the growth of your business?
Yeah, so I hope it's kind of becomes our job. The fundraiser is awesome until it's then done, and you then need to deliver on that. And it's about making a much bigger impact, for the company and for our team and shareholders and the sector as a whole. It's about making a much bigger impact much quicker. What some companies will look to do in 10, 20, 30 years, like we need to be delivering in, quarters, 1 year, 2 years, etc. So yeah, it's about accelerating that impact and really accelerating what's possible. Yeah, and I think it's been interesting for us because we raised just prior to the big kind of AI boom. So there's actually been a lot of evolution for us over the last sort of year or so in terms of thinking of, I guess, kind of like rethinking the value that we can deliver. So I think originally when we were thinking about this, it was very much around how do we kind of minimize the admin through efficiency? How do we kind of free up people's time by helping them have the right data, the right insights, the right tasks, the right interface with the frontline workforce. And that all remains true, but there's an extra, for me, like actually much more exciting layer on top of that, which is actually how do we just start doing some of these tasks? Why do we need someone to input various bits of data to then look at different bits of insights, to then send reminders to people or, follow-ups or send them some training content? That's all very planned out. Like, why does someone need to do that? The place we're getting to in the product and for our customers, yeah, people will log on in the morning and instead of seeing, here's a massive task list, like Merry Christmas, we've really efficiently created you 1,000 tasks. Instead of seeing that, well, they're now, well, they're now.
Can you imagine? Oh, this
Well,
system's great.
yeah, well, and I think that's the thing, right? Because once you get all the data together, then like that's the next step, right? You pull all of this data together and it tells you like, okay, these are the things you need to do to fix it. So actually we're just like a super efficient task generator.
Yeah.
And it's required because those tasks still need to be done. But the what our customers are now seeing is there's a split there. So we're like, okay, these are all the tasks you didn't know you needed to do, but you do. But actually these ones, they've been done for you. So, we identified off the back of the last safety briefing that, this part of the message didn't come through. So we've, rejigged the way that the briefing is structured and we've redistributed it out to the people already. You can press this button and you can see like what the responses are and you can see the statuses as an example. Or alternatively, we can see, we have a bunch of customers in gas. So, we are constantly verifying things like gas safe registrations and qualifications and this kind of thing, and then layering on top the capabilities. So same idea. Instead of just identifying the trends and the insights and saying, well, okay, here you go, here's some insights, you go and do something about it. There are some base things that we can just do. Instead of people used to have a process where they would literally have a list and they go through and check like once a week or once a month or once a year, like, whether qualifications still existed or whether they've been rescinded. Our product does that like thousands and thousands and thousands of times every day. So that's just a task that no one ever has to do ever again. So and as soon as there's a potential delay or a lapsing certificate or something isn't the way that it should be, or potentially isn't going to be the way that it should be, then the right people are notified, or we actually just book people onto a training course automatically. And when I'm saying we, it's very much like the royal we, because it's the product doing it for us. So I think the funding in particular, as we say, is about delivering more value, like more quickly, and delivering a bigger impact. And that impact for us is still the same foundation, centralizing the data in the right place so that the right people can see, whether that's an individual or whether it's like company wide or anything in between, the right people can see if there are gaps and where there's opportunities to improve, um, letting them do that, obviously. But then layering on top of that, actually, there's plenty of places, plenty of opportunities for us to just do the work and just do that admin work for them. And it's freeing up, hours and hours of time a week. And that's going into more impact, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned there, and it's similar to the sort of processes that we have here, in the sense that building a system that doesn't just highlight where you're going wrong or generating tasks, as you say. Merry Christmas, here's 1,000 tasks for you to do, but which is a great line, by the way. But also a system that leverages AI and automation in a way that can deal with some of those tasks for you. So it's not just highlighting what you're doing wrong, bottling it right down, but also here is the solution, and on top of that, I've already done it. And the ability to, one, be able to deliver that, but two, there's also the side of, as a business, being at the forefront of the new technology that's coming into the market that allows you to further build your system and make it more efficient, because that in itself is a task. If you just take the AI sector at the moment, which is a booming sector, who knows where we're going to end up with it. But there's so much coming out that's thick and fast. Even, we use AI, we help, from a sales and marketing perspective, we help our clients sort of leverage automation and various other things. But it's staying on top of that, and what's coming out, what is useful to you, and trying to be at the cutting edge of that is in itself almost a role within a business, So for you guys, and you mentioned the funding that's come in and what it's allowed you to do. I imagine that it's also freed you up internally, not just freeing up your clients' time, but freed you up internally to be able, or certainly add to your team to be able to, allocate resources to that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the key thing, is the opportunity, and with the experimentation and this kind of thing. Sometimes it is literally, there are, I don't know, maybe four to six, depending on your view, but 4 to 6 like foundational like models, or at least like model providers. They're always bringing out new versions of the different models, but that's just kind of the AI side of things. So actually tackling that and trying to work out the right mix and the right blend of those. But then also, anyone could just take stuff and just shove it into ChatGPT, and you're fundamentally going to get the same stuff out, within reason. So it's then all of the additional like fine tuning. But different customers have different requirements, right? They have different priorities. So it's about making sure that AI is like one kind of facet. I think to me it feels similar to kind of like cloud computing, where back in the no one talks about like cloud computing now because it's just like how things work. But back in the day, like that was a thing. You're a cloud native like software provider, and people talk about you're like AI native. But in the not too distant future, like that just won't be a thing. That's just how it will be. It will just be part of the mix. So I think it's just trying to take all of those different elements, and just trying to give the best foundation and the best platform for customers to be able to deliver what they need to deliver and prioritize what they need to prioritize, because businesses are very, very different. And I think particularly for some of the kind of larger infrastructure scale projects, the specifications and the regulations and actually the client requirements quite often limit the ability to differentiate. If you're working on the highway, there are many, many, many standards that you have to adhere to. So fundamentally, like the objective is, someone builds a road, like the road's always the same, right? That's the point. It doesn't matter who builds it. So you have to look for other alternative ways of differentiating yourself. And you know, the way and us enabling people to do that in the right way is important. So yeah, there's a lot of different facets to this, and there's a lot of opportunity. But for me, that's the you know that's the exciting thing, because you know we've seen customers like do some like weird stuff with the product that was not designed to do, and it's awesome. Like it's great. Like just because we didn't think about using it that way, the fact that they're using it that way and it's delivering value for their business, for their customers, and you know the wider community is great. So yeah, you know we're going to keep doing that, keep pushing on, and yeah, you know keep working hard in the space.
I think that is a great way to round this off, Kane. It's a very positive way to do it. What you're doing there sounds fantastic, and I'll be watching with a keen eye because it sounds really great. And I wish you the best of luck with it. Thank you very much for coming on. Where can our listeners find you, Kane?
So you can continue to mess up my LinkedIn. Kane St Quintin is on there, but or just visiblyhq.com and just hop on the website. Any of those is good. Yeah, but no, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate what you're doing for the sector and the space. And yeah, I think the more of us that can be pushing ahead and actually really investing in the space, I think it's going to make a difference to a lot of people.
Kane, thank you very much for coming on, and I'll see you soon.
Yep. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Bye.